Welcome to the Stirring the Gumbo Pot podcast, the podcast about the history, the culture, and the accomplishments of Black people. This podcast aims to inspire, educate, empower, and celebrate the lives of Black folk. I am your host, the Cajun Peach, and thank you for tuning in. Now let's get this pot stirring. Welcome to Season 3 of the Stirring the Gumbo Pot podcast. It feels so good to be back to bring you another season of honoring and celebrating the lives of my people, those who paved the way for our freedoms and civil rights, Africans who were stolen from Africa and brought to a foreign land solely for the purpose of being indigenous slaves. I built this platform because I love my people, especially the fearless ancestors who fought the fight and stood in the face of racism, segregation, and in many cases, death. The same ancestors whose shoulders I stand on. I believe it is my duty, as well as my calling in life, to share our stories and to educate my people. This episode is dedicated to all of the unsung heroes of the movement. I dedicate this episode to the ones mentioned and unmentioned, the unsung heroes for our fight for freedom and justice and civil rights in America. In today's episode, we're diving into one of the most pivotal events of the civil rights movement, the Montgomery Bus Boycott. This movement, sparked by the arrest of Mrs. Rosa Parks in 1955, was more than just a protest against segregation on public transportation. It was a powerful act of resistance that ignited a nationwide push for equality. So let's take a journey back in time and explore how a simple act of defiance and protest turned into a movement that changed the course of American history. Joining me today is Dr. Clyde Robertson, who will help us unpack the impact of the boycott and discuss the courageous individuals, some known and unknown, who led the charge for civil rights in America. Thank you for joining me today, Dr. Robertson. I really appreciate you joining the Stirring the Gumbo Pot podcast today to talk about the civil rights movement in honor of Black History Month and year, all 365 days, in some cases 366. Now, tell everybody who you are, and we can start the interview.
Well, first and foremost, you're quite welcome, and it's an honor for me to be on your program. As you stated, my name is Dr. Clyde Robertson. I am the director for the Center for African and African American Studies and an associate professor of humanities here at Southern University at New Orleans, also known as SUNO. I am a native New Orleanian. In fact, I was not born, but reared in the neighborhood in which Southern University at New Orleans is housed, the historic Pontchartrain Park. I was educated in New Orleans in terms of my elementary and high school education, and I attended Clark College in Atlanta, where I majored in mass communications with a concentration in broadcast management. I went on to pursue my master's degree in communications theory from Howard. Post graduating from Howard, I started teaching on the university level at Xavier University first, and then Alabama State University. I did that for 6 years before returning to school to start on my Ph.D. And I eventually earned my Ph.D. in 1988 from Temple University in Africology, or Africana Studies. And I have been endeavoring to impact upon this field of Africology since, I would say 1992 professionally. I've been working in the realm of Africology ever since.
Thank you. I feel so honored to have you as a guest on my show today, especially during this time because in our in this country, the climate that we're in right now with a new repeat president who seems to have a goal of erasing our history and our culture in this country. And we as Black people cannot allow that. I don't care how many rules and laws they pass to try to erase us. It could never happen. So it's something I'm passionate about, specifically on this show. So I'm glad you came on so we can have this conversation today. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was really what ignited the modern civil rights movement as we know. Upon my research, I learned that the impetus of the movement was during the Montgomery Bus Boycott. Would that be accurate?
Well, you have to recognize the Montgomery Bus Boycott had influences. It just didn't emerge out of a cocoon. Actually, here in Louisiana, maybe 60 miles west of us in Baton Rouge, there was a very successful bus boycott, led by a gentleman named Jemison, Reverend Jemison, who was a Baptist minister, who happened to be from Montgomery, Alabama, and Alabama State University. Reverend Jemison actually successfully orchestrated a bus boycott in Baton Rouge, utilizing in very large measure Southern University students and activist professors, as well as the general community. There was also a bus boycott, if I'm not mistaken, in Norfolk, Virginia, which led to a subsequent boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. Again, Reverend Jemison's connection to Montgomery is not by happenstance. It was through Jemison's connection with those major players in Montgomery, like E.D. Nixon, Rosa Parks, and Joanne Robinson, that you then see, subsequent to the Baton Rouge experience, that civil rights activity and human rights activity in Montgomery, Alabama. So, while the vast majority of the world understood Montgomery as being, or misinterpreted Montgomery as being the womb that gave birth to the quote unquote modern civil rights movement, that particular movement was inspired by and encouraged by other movements that pre-existed that particular endeavor. And we have to recognize the significance of local leadership. Martin Luther King was merely a spokesperson, an eloquent spokesperson, but a spokesperson. In Montgomery, Alabama, there was an organization called the Montgomery Improvement Association. The Montgomery Improvement Association was populated by native Montgomeryans and those persons who lived around Montgomery. Again, the father of that initiative was the great E.D. Nixon. And so it was a core of local people in Montgomery that kept that movement moving. And the relationship between those persons and Reverend Jemison, who was in Baton Rouge, is extremely important as well. And that's the information that most novice readers of civil and human rights struggles, particularly local struggles that happen to impact upon national movements, miss. That's what the casual reader of history will miss. And they will mistakenly place Dr. Martin Luther King at the top, the cherry on top of that pie. No, Reverend King was a main ingredient of the pie, but certainly not the cherry.
Yes, understood. And that's what I've learned during my research. Now, for myself, growing up in public education, of course, the people who we learned about, which was only limited in that it was Dr. King and Rosa Parks, and that's probably it, right? So there are some unknown and unsung heroes, I would like to call them, in the movement. And for example, Claudette Colvin, who happened, what I learned, and I may be wrong because I'm not a scholar, but I understand that she was actually the first person to be arrested for taking a seat, not taking a seat, but keeping her seat, because the seat she was in the back. And a white woman demanded that she be removed from the back section where she was supposed to be seated, and she was arrested.
Well, you're absolutely right about that young lady. She was actually a student at then Booker Washington High School. But she was not the first person to have been arrested on the bus, or arrested while seated on Montgomery public transit systems. She did not have the pedigree that Rosa Parks had. And so there was not a mass movement that emerged as a result of that young lady having been dragged off the bus and beaten. And of course, there had been men who were arrested in Montgomery, beaten, and in some extreme cases killed. So that young lady was not the first person in the history of Montgomery to be arrested and dragged off the buses. But she was certainly one whose experience made history. There was not a movement around her and her experience because of her family's history. And so the leaders of African American Montgomery understood clearly that promoting her case would have led to some unfortunate results. However, Rosa Parks was a pillar of the Black community, a well-respected person, a dignified, in quotes, a dignified person, and a person who was quite active in the NAACP. Rosa Parks was a prepared individual.
Right.
She had taken part in very many workshops. She was a trained protester and a prepared protester. She had participated in movements prior to her having been arrested on the bus. And she was the secretary to Mr. E.D. Nixon, who had been given an honorary doctorate, who is also known as Dr. E.D. Nixon, despite the fact that he did not have a high school diploma. He was a larger-than-life figure. He was a very large man, and he had a larger-than-life personality. He was a Pullman's porter. And so he had traveled the world, or traveled the United States as a Pullman's porter, and brought a lot of the ideologies that he had experienced around the country back to Montgomery with him. He was also an adherent to Asa Philip Randolph, and was very involved in the Pullman's Porter Union. And so he, being a master organizer, understood clearly the importance of Rosa Parks having been arrested, and he quickly amassed a movement around her arrest. there's something else that we have to recognize. And for whatever the reason, reasons that we understand, the women's part in the Montgomery movement has been rendered second string, when in fact, women were instrumentally involved with every aspect of the Montgomery movement. There was something called the WPC, the Women's Political Conference. And those women who were educators and secretaries and professional women of their day, they were the ones who called for the initial boycott in response to Rosa Parks' arrest. Rosa Parks was familiar with that organization, if not active in the organization, the WPC. We know about the WPC because Professor Joanne Robinson from Alabama State College, at the time Alabama State University now, actually wrote a book entitled The Montgomery Bus Boycott and the Women Who Started It. She writes voluminously and articulately about the role that women played in the Montgomery movement. And of course, you have grassroots women like Zakoza Williams, Georgia Gilmore, and others who raised sizable amounts of money to support the over-year-long bus boycott. What many people don't know is that while Black people boycotted the buses, they still had to get around the city. And to do that, the Montgomery Improvement Association established a transportation arm. And the money raised by Georgia Gilmore, Zakoza Williams, and others helped purchase cars, helped maintain cars that the MIA used to transport Black people from one place to another for over a year. The Montgomery Bus Boycott, and most importantly, the Montgomery Improvement Association, the organization that promoted and supported that movement, should be studied by all persons interested in how to mobilize and sustain a sustainable movement against oppression and racism.
And that's interesting because I watched a YouTube, and that's how I learned about the MIA, the Montgomery Improvement Association, as well as E.D. Nixon. And the video is called, for my listeners, the video on YouTube is called Sitting for Justice. It's all about the start and how the Montgomery Bus Boycott started. And it did talk about Miss Joanne Robertson and her work, Robinson and her work, and E.D. Nixon and Attorney Fred Gray also. So that leads me into my next question for you to speak to. Can you maybe share with my listeners on the importance of research and self-education on the history of the African Americans in this country?
It is essential. First, we have to recognize that African and African American, African global history is world history. African American history is the history of the United States and the world. And to remove, like you would a piece of a puzzle from the general puzzle, leaves the puzzle incomplete. And so what we have in the United States in particular, but not exclusively within the United States, because this happens as a result of global white supremacy. But what you have in the United States is an incomplete puzzle, which is why when compared to other persons around the world, the average so-called American is lacking a global perspective. because this country has practiced isolationism for so long. And so first and foremost, we have to recognize that African American history is American history, and that there's no part of this country's history that African people did not have a part in making. There's not a war fought by this country, and this country has fought myriad wars. There's not a war, there's not a component of militias or military service that African Americans did not serve in, men and women. There's not a part of the industrial age, the agrarian age, the revolutionary age. There's not a part of this country's history that we were not a part of. And very many African American people also participated in the creation of global history. And so by ignoring that, it does a disservice to all so-called Americans. By ignoring that, it helps to minimize the knowledge level of all people. But in particular, African American people must invest time, effort, and money into the study of self. We have been convinced that we have done nothing. We have been told that. We have been convinced of it.
Exactly.
And we must break out of this cocoon. We must come out of this cocoon as beautiful butterflies do.
I agree.
Or else we're doomed.
I agree. Because for me, I call it the Sankofa effect. You have to know your history, or what came before you, in order to know how to navigate the world that we're in, or to set a future to teach your children about our history in this country. And so for me, I wasn't taught that. My mom, she didn't teach that to me. I didn't learn it in school. I learned this on my own through college. I went back to college as an adult, and I wanted to study our history, our culture, African American studies, African studies. I had to know. It's something in me that I need to know these things. And for people to go through life not even recognizing or knowing some of these names you called, some of the events that happened, how we got our freedoms, who fought for us. It's just crazy to me how people are not hungry for that knowledge. And it just, I don't understand. And that's why I created this podcast, to share that information to whoever listens to this show. It doesn't have to be millions of people, but to my audience who engage, you're going to learn about our history and our culture on this podcast. So, yeah.
Well, it's very important for your audience to know that African American history is not confined to a month, and we have to understand what's happening currently. There is an emergence, and it's a quickly developing emergence. It's a quickly developing movement that is actually rooted in the past, but there is a white nationalist agenda that is being publicly expressed at the highest levels of local, state, regional, and national politics, that is diminishing everyone who is not a white nationalist. Now, that doesn't mean you have to be a white person, because there are Black people who promote white nationalism. There are Asians and Asiatics. There are Latinos, the mestizos, who promote white nationalism. But we're in an era now that I've lived through before. We're in an era now that is unabashedly white nationalist in its foundation. And to survive this, one has to become knowledgeable of self. One has to recognize the significance of self. Because there is an Afrocentric psychological theory called looking glass self disorder. And eventually one starts looking at oneself through the same prism as those who oppress you because of the inundation of these negative and stereotypic views and expressions. And so to avoid this pitfall, one must become immersive. You have to become immersed in who and whose you are in order to understand other people. You have to understand other people on your terms, not necessarily theirs. So if you are half of a human being and your knowledge is limited, then what you will eventually do is you're going to try to meld into somebody else's reality.
Exactly.
And that is immensely culturally and psychologically unhealthy. So when we talk about, for example, the civil rights movement, there was a civil rights era during which there were several phases and directions taken by very many people. The civil rights component, which was that strive to become citizens of this United States, that was just one component of the era. There was a Black nationalist movement. There was a group of people who weren't necessarily interested in becoming part and parcel of this country and its tenets, wanted to live free and independent, a Black nationalist movement. So within the civil rights era, there were several components to the movement. And we have to understand significant people. We know Rosa Parks. We know Martin Luther King. Some of us know Malcolm. We recognize the name Malcolm, but we don't necessarily understand his philosophies and the various stages that he experienced in his life. We know I Have a Dream, Martin Luther King. We don't necessarily know his stance against white supremacy at the end of his life, his stance against militarism and the industrial military complex and the industrial prison complex. We don't know the growth of these two leaders. We certainly don't know Mary Church Terrell, Harriet Jacobs. We certainly don't know David Walker. We certainly don't know, very few of us know Henry McNeil Turner, who in the 1800s, it was 1830, Bishop Henry McNeil Turner at the first Black Baptist Convention in 1898 told the assemblage that God was Black. The audacity. We don't know these people. We've never heard of these people. And so it is incumbent upon our institutions, our schools, our universities to do this. Now, you spoke about your mother. Well, I grew up in a home where my parents recognized that there was an inadequate education taking place regarding my brother and me. My parents were both teachers. And my parents drank the Kool-Aid. They actually thought that because the Supreme Court ruled separate and equal in the Brown versus Board decision to be illegal, they thought white people would just, cave in and open up their arms. They had no idea what was befalling my brother and me as we were integrated into these Catholic schools in the middle 1960s. the early moving towards the middle 1960s. My brother and I caught hell at a place called St. Gabriel Elementary School. They had no idea. But when they did recognize the holes, the gulf-sized holes in our education, and they recognized my personal interest in the history of African people, they started a school after school for my brother and me. And so the books that we brought into our home were books that weren't necessarily grade appropriate, but they were books that exposed its readers to the rich history of African people, both politically, culturally, and historically. And so at a very early age, my brother and I were required to read Black Like Me, Man-Child in the Promised Land, Soledad Brothers, Soul on Ice. We were required to read the autobiography of Harriet Jacobs and David Walker's Appeal and Black English. I remember that was one of the books. And my brother and I both have. I've lost some of mine because of Katrina, but my brother, because he lives in Atlanta, still has his books. The Ebony Pictorial Encyclopedia. We had all of that in the 1960s through the 1970s. And so, you know, my brother and I had a foundation upon which we stood that our friends did not. And so while, you know, the going certainly got tough for the two of us, both in terms of our experience as children of desegregation. It wasn't really integration. These were desegregated schools. That's all. Mm-hmm. St. Gabriel, Holy Cross for my brother, Brother Martin for me. We still had a grounding. We had a historical grounding that separated us from our friends who had no such grounding. And so they became more greatly impacted upon by the environment than my brother and I did. So schools after schools, it is incumbent upon our institutions, whether they're churches or community centers, Nord playgrounds, Tambourine and Fan is an excellent example. You could not parade with a tambourine and fan or play tambourine and fan football and baseball if you did not attend their Black liberation schools. The Black Panthers understood it clearly when they created Black liberation schools, as well as free breakfast programs and sickle cell anemia testing and the other myriad social programs that the Black Panthers launched. Those programs are successful in creating knowledgeable people, many of whom on whom you can rely and depend. But we've got to become self-reliant again. Because if not, we're doomed.
We are. And I agree with that. And so people need to change their mindset, stop scrolling, and start learning about your history in this country and where we come from, and continue to celebrate and honor the ones who came before us. Now, as we end our conversation, can you tell me a little bit about the center at SUNO? Is it open to the public, or is it just for students, or can people come in and learn in the center?
Well, we don't. Well, there is attached to SUNO, and it's a work in progress. There is a museum that is under the auspices of SUNO, and it's directed by a young lady named Erica Witt. It's called SUNOMA, the Southern University Museum of Art. She's in the process of establishing an exhibit. We're changing out one exhibit and replacing that with another exhibit that I think will be launched on the 17th of this month. And yes, that's open to the public. You have to call and make arrangements, schedule visits. Okay. The Center for African and African American Studies goes back to 1989. It's been in existence for quite some time. I arrived 8 years ago. When I arrived, I established some hallmark programming. We have 4 programs, major programs a year, to which the public is cordially invited. We have our Harambe program at the very beginning of the year, which pulls together the campus and community, because that's what Harambe is, a calling together, a pulling together. And so our Harambe program this academic year was an election pep rally, and it featured the brilliance of our Congressman Troy Carter. And he looked at what was at stake moving into the 2024 election. We premiered a documentary that I produced thereafter. This was in early December. Trailblazers and History Makers, the Pontchartrain Park Pioneers documentary premiere and celebration. And we invited the public. This documentary probes the history of Pontchartrain Park and those dynamic pioneers who helped to populate Pontchartrain Park and sustain it over the years. We talked to 10 persons who purchased homes between 1955 and 1965. So that was the second program. That was a Kwanzaa-based program. We have that every year. We have our Harambe in the fall and our Kwanzaa in the fall going into the winter months. Now, we also have something called in January, it's a Martin Luther King week celebration, Living Legends, where we celebrate grassroots legends who have toiled on behalf of the African American community. These are primarily local people who, again, have uplifted the lives of the Black community for no less than 25 to 30 years. We have celebrated people like Malik Rahim, Anthony Bean, Sister Mariama Curry, Dr. Keith C. Ferdinand, Sisters Vera Warren and Jennifer Turner at the Community Book Center, Brother Fred Milo Johnson. And this year we celebrated Sister Angela A. Allen Bell, the great civil rights attorney who has nullified the Louisiana practice of non-unanimous juries. That educator, that legal scholar, that author, that change agent, Sister Angela Bell, that was only 2 weeks ago. And in February, later this month, the community is cordially invited to attend our Charles Fry Memorial Lecture. The topic, where do we go from here? African America post the 2024 presidential election. And we have SUNO's own, the state of Louisiana's own Senator Joe Bowie, who has the unique capability of talking about where do we go from here
And
on a local, state, and national level. And so the community is, and that's January 21st.
it's January or we're in February?
I'm sorry, sister. I'm sorry. February 21st. That's February 21st from 10 until 12:30. And it's going to be in the Southern University at New Orleans, Millie Charles School of Social Work auditorium. And that's free and open to the public. We pay particular attention to bringing out school children to that activity, high school children. Our programs generally attract between 200 and 300 people.
Wow.
And they are very impactful programs. Again, we also conduct research. You asked, so I'm telling you,
Mm-hmm.
we conduct research. Our major recent research endeavor was a 5-year research project involving Pontchartrain Park's history and impact on the city of New Orleans and state of Louisiana and the country. And we started by developing an oral history project. That oral history project then splintered into a journal that was produced, and then ultimately the documentary. It's taken about a 5-year track, and we're still continuing our discussion about Pontchartrain Park. The very next discussion will look at the generations following the trailblazers. That's the children and grandchildren of those trailblazers who were impacted upon by this very historic neighborhood. And so it's the center conducts research. The center, I'm also a professor. I teach humanities, African American and African humanities, and we sponsor very rich and impactful programs.
Sounds like a lot of hard work and dedication.
It is, because I don't have a staff, so it falls upon me and volunteers.
Wow. Now, can you repeat the name of the Pontchartrain Park documentary?
The documentary is titled Trailblazers and History Makers, the Pontchartrain Park Pioneers, Trailblazers and History Makers,
Okay.
the Pontchartrain Park Pioneers.
Okay, I'm writing that down because
And
I'm going to go look it up.
yeah, well, it's not on YouTube just yet. I am in the process of purchasing some of the material that we used, so I can't release it
Okay.
until I have paid for the usage of some stock footage.
Right, okay.
But that's in the process of occurring right now. I can showcase it at film celebrations and things of that nature, but I can't release it to YouTube.
Right.
Can't release it on YouTube or on PBS just yet.
Right, till you get cleared for that, right. Mm-hmm.
Until I'm, yes.
Understood.
Film festivals and the like, yes, but not widely distributed.
Gotcha. Understood. Well,
But it was premiered, and it was premiered quite successfully. In fact, the Louisiana Week did a 2-page spread on it back in December. Let's see the date of that release, January 30th. The Louisiana Weekly showcased it and featured it in their publication, 2-page spread.
okay. The Louisiana Weekly, huh? I remember them in
Yes.
school. So good to know they're still in existence. I would like to thank you again for all of the insight, all of the information, all of the knowledge that you just dropped with this conversation we had. I really appreciate you joining me today. And to my listeners, continue to fight, continue to learn, and just share what you know with the youngsters today, because they're the ones who have to stand on our shoulders moving forward. Is there anything you would like to say, Dr. Robinson, before we go?
I did fail to mention the significance of learning local history. And those of us from New Orleans are extremely blessed because we have a city that's steeped in African and African American history. All history actually begins locally. So as we learn about these national change agents, we must recognize that there are very strategic people and very strategic experiences that are housed right beneath our feet. And in some of our cases, inside of our homes. We have to first learn about our local change agents and move outward. So it begins inward and then it moves outward.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And those persons who are interested in learning more about CAST, that's the Center for African and African American Studies, and all that we do, don't hesitate to call 504-286-5384.
504-286-5384.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you.
Thank you for hosting me.
Rosa Parks by Nikki Giovanni. This is for the Pullman Porters who organized when people said they couldn't and carried the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender to the Black Americans in the South so they would know they were not alone. This is for the Pullman Porters who helped Thurgood Marshall go south and come back north to fight the fight that resulted in Brown v. Board of Education, because even though Kansas is west, and even though Topeka is the birthplace of Gwendolyn Brooks, who wrote the powerful "The Chicago Defender Sends a Man to Little Rock," it was the Pullman Porters who whispered to the traveling men, both the bluesmen and the racemen, so that they both would know what was going on. This is for the Pullman Porters who smiled as if they were happy and laughed like they were tickled when some folks were around, and who silently rejoiced in 1954 when the Supreme Court announced its 9-0 decision that separate is inherently unequal. This is for the Pullman Porters who smiled and welcomed a 14-year-old boy onto their train in 1955. They noticed his slight limp as he tried to disguise with a doo-wop walk. They noticed the stutter and probably understood why his mother wanted him out of Chicago during the summer when school was out. 14-year-old black boys with limps and stutters are apt to try to prove themselves in dangerous ways when mothers aren't around to look after them. So this is for the Pullman Porters who looked over that 14-year-old while the train rolled the reverse of the Blues Highway from Chicago to St. Louis to Memphis to Mississippi. This is for the men who kept him safe. And if Emmett Till had been able to stay on a train all summer, he would have maybe grown a bit of a paunch, certainly lost his hair, probably have worn bifocals and bounced his grandchildren on his knee, telling them about his summer riding the rails. But he had to get off the train and ended up in Money, Mississippi, and was brutally, horribly, inexcusably, and unacceptably murdered. This is for the Pullman Porters who, when the sheriff was trying to get the body secretly buried, got Emmett's body on the northbound train, got his body home to Chicago, where his mother said, "I want the world to see what they did to my boy." And this is for all the mothers who cried. And this is for all the people who said never again. And this is about Rosa Parks, whose feet were not so tired. It had been, after all, an ordinary day until the bus driver gave her the opportunity to make history. This is about Mrs. Rosa Parks from Tuskegee, Alabama, who was also the field secretary of the NAACP. This is about the moment Rosa Parks shouldered her cross, put her worldly goods aside, was willing to sacrifice her life so that that young man in Money, Mississippi, who had been so well protected by the Pullman Porters, would not have died in vain. When Mrs. Parks said no, a passionate movement was begun. No longer would there be a reliance on the law, there was a higher law. When Mrs. Parks brought that light of hers to expose the evil of the system, the sun came and rested on her shoulders, bringing the heat and the light of truth. Others would follow Mrs. Parks. 4 young men in Greensboro, North Carolina would also say no. Great voices would be raised, singing the praises of God and exhorting us to forgive those who trespass against us. but it was the Pullman porters who safely got Emmett to his granduncle, and it was Mrs. Rosa Parks who could not stand that death. And in not being able to stand it, she sat back down. Well, that wraps up another episode of the Stirring the Gumbo Pot podcast. I really appreciate you all listening in and for being a supporter of the show. So in the spirit of Don Cornelius, I wish you all love,